How do you all do your planning today? How many people have a big spreadsheet to do their contact center planning? Yeah. Okay. What else do folks use? The longer term planning. Anybody? Yost, what do most people use?
Spreadsheets.
Spreadsheets, big spreadsheets. Okay. Well, I'll go ahead and get started, even though we're a couple minutes early here. Just as a brief introduction, my name is Rick Kasiba. I'm a mathematician by trade. I went to school for engineering. When I used to build buildings, and when I first got my very first job, I sat down and started drawing out buildings and sizing beams and all that sort of stuff, and I rapidly realized that I hated it. And then somehow I ended up in the call center space. It's kind of a weird transition. Come on in, guys. But I've been doing this for about 23 years now. I've been working in call centers, contact centers. I worked for a little while for a couple airlines in the United States, Northwest Airlines and US Airways, and then a couple big banks. And then about 14 years ago, after my big bank, we found out that the company was being bought and they were closing down our office. We had about 3 months to sit around and do sort of nothing, waiting for the company to, our branch of the company to be laid off. And I got together with some friends and we started thinking, hey, can we start something up? And we ended up starting a little company called Bay Bridge Decision Technologies, which was focused on contact center planning. 2 years ago, we were acquired by Interactive Intelligence. And one of the things that we never ever dreamed was going to happen happened, which was that we were actually going to start selling the product and talking to people outside of the United States. We're always small, and I never ever dreamed that I'd be sitting here in the Netherlands talking to folks about contact center planning, but very, very excited to be here. You've got a beautiful, beautiful country. Everybody has been very, very nice. I appreciate the fact that you guys are going to listen to this in English. I don't think I can do 3 words in Dutch. What we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about three major things. One is we're going to talk about long-term planning and what it is. We're going to talk about the technologies that are out there. And then probably most interesting for folks over here is we're going to talk about tips and tricks for long-term forecasting. So one of the things that, and I'll repeat myself a few times, one of the things that as part of my job, I have seen more contact center planning spreadsheets than probably anybody on the planet. So we'll talk about things that I've seen in people's spreadsheets that can be improved, things that you could take home with you and improve your contact center operation. If I were to walk around and talk to folks over here who do workforce planning, I think if you were to ask them, maybe at the bar tonight, if you were to say, what is the definition of workforce planning or workforce management, what you'd almost always hear is some variation of workforce management is about making sure that you have the right number of agents at the right time in order to hit some sort of service goal. But there's really 2 parts to this, and the first is making sure that your daily operation, your tactical operation is nimble and efficient and able to change when things change in your environment. So for example, if your volumes start coming in higher than you expected that day, workforce management will help you figure out ways to offer overtime or things to do in the environment so that you can try to keep your service levels intact. Workforce management does a great job of scheduling employees and making sure that it's sufficient. The one thing, and when you look back at the definition of what workforce management is, the one thing that workforce management doesn't do, traditional workforce management software doesn't do, is to make sure that you have the right number of people there in the first place. The second part is making sure that week over week, we have exactly the right number of agents who are, when the door opens up on the call center, the right number of agents sit down at their desks and are available to answer calls. So most traditional workforce management software does not answer that problem. It does not help you with figuring out week over week how many agents you need. Traditional workforce management software tends to focus on today, tomorrow, maybe next week, to some degree a couple weeks out, maybe 3, 4, 5 weeks out. They work, this is just one of those light bulb moments for us, which is they work to manage the agents that you have, not the number of agents that you need. It's given my current workforce and the current number of people who are sitting at their desks ready to answer calls, how do I best manage those folks? The strategic plan, the longer term plan, is where you figure out how many agents you need. It's when you put together your budget, when you put together your plan, when you reevaluate your plan, is where you help to manage the seasonality of the business. So anyway, so there's traditional workforce management and there's strategic planning. The vast majority of folks that I talk to in the States, there is a hybrid strategic planning spreadsheet, maybe with a little help from the workforce management system, but there's a whole other process that's out there to help them figure out how to forecast, how to figure out how many agents they need week over week, and then put together the operational plan, when to hire my agents and those sorts of things. In order, but it's a hybrid of a spreadsheet and their workforce management tool. Okay, so let's talk about what strategic planning is. There's really four major functions in long-term strategic planning. The first is forecasting. So it's helping you forecast all the things that go into your plan, your volumes and your handle times and your sick time and your agent attrition rate, and if you're an outbound shop, maybe your calling rates or your contact rates. So the first step is to forecast all those things. The second step is to take all of those forecasts and figure out exactly how many agents you need week over week. So if I know that over the next 18 months, here's the week over week, here's the number of agents I need. Here's the volumes I'm going to get. Then I want to convert that to the number of agents that I need. The third step then is to look at that and say, okay, when should I hire my agents? What's the best combination between hiring and using overtime to get me to my seasonal peaks and valleys? When should I offer training? When should I when should I offer vacation and those sorts of things? So that's the third step, which is put together, oftentimes called a capacity plan. And then the fourth step is to take that information and roll it into a budget. The best processes that we see are highly automated so that you can actually go from forecast to completed budget relatively quick. The other thing that the best plans have is some sort of process which proves that they're accurate. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. And this planning process complements workforce management. It doesn't do workforce management. It doesn't replace workforce management, but it complements workforce management. Are there any questions or thoughts, guys, so far? Okay. Please, it's much better if this is a little bit more of a dialogue. And I do realize that I talk fast, so you can always tell me to slow down. Okay, so why do we have to do all of this stuff? The first is if you look at, I don't know if I have a little, do I have a little? I don't. The graph up at the top, upper left, is just a typical call volume forecast. Okay, most companies have some sort of seasonality associated with their call volumes. Many companies have a lot of seasonality associated with their call centers. So they will. We have customers who. Between valley and peak is maybe 3 times the number of agents required to get to their seasonal peaks. So that's the first thing. Second thing, there's seasonality to other items like sick time. What's interesting about sick time is, when people call in sick, is that there's usually seasonal patterns to that. Think about that. And not only that, but what I have drawn here in this graph is 4 different centers, all of whom have different sick time patterns. And it makes perfect sense. People call in sick, at least in the States, they call in sick when the weather's nice. They call in sick around football games. They call in sick around party weekends. They call in sick, just whenever there's a nice weekend, right? And because nice weekends happen at different times at different geographical locations, you might see a different seasonal pattern in the States up in Boston than you would see down in Florida, right? Because it's nice at different times of the year. But the seasonal patterns are almost always there, and they're almost always locally predictable. So you can predict those. Attrition is also differently seasonal and differently predictable. So for example, I might have one center where there's a lot of competition for in the job market. I'm going to have a different attrition rate than I do in another part of the. Yeah, please.
Can you explain attrition?
Oh, I'm sorry. Attrition. It's a term that means when your agents quit. So agents quitting. It's often called agent attrition. Okay.
And then your fourth Dutch word, we call it furlough.
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 Oh, okay. Furlough.
And what are the other 3, by the way? I'm curious.
Or the other 3.
The other 3 words you know in Dutch.
See, furlough is one. Actually, I don't know anything. I don't know. Is high a word? Yeah. High? See, I got that one. So it's agent attrition. Handle time is also something that's usually very different, and it's not necessarily differently seasonal, but it's certainly different. I was raised in Southern California. We talk extremely fast, as you all see. And folks in Texas in the United States talk extraordinarily slow. And surprisingly, their handle times are very different center to center. And all of those things are things that you need to take into consideration. Do you have examples of that? Okay, the reason why I'm talking about all of this is because if you do your planning process well, what it means is that you're going to have a much smoother workforce management process. The daily operation is going to be smoother because you have the right number of people there in the first place. There's also going to be fewer hiccups. The term is fewer unexpected events because you can plan for them in advance to some degree. Not only that, but if I do a good job of figuring out how many people I need week over week and putting together a very optimal plan for making sure that I hire at the right time and offer overtime at the right time, I'm going to end up with lower costs. And like I said, we've seen an awful lot of spreadsheets. So what I'm going to talk about next is a lot of the errors that I see in people's plans, in people's planning spreadsheets. And I came up with my top 10 list. And this is them. The reason I put this here, I'm not going to talk to it, I'll talk to them individually, is so that you can actually, when you get the copy of the presentation, tape it up onto your wall and you can see what all the things that you shouldn't be doing. Okay, the first one is don't flatline shrinkage. Shrinkage is are items like sick time, what else? It's time away from the phone. And what we see in a lot of people's spreadsheets is they say, okay, it could be vacation, it could be training, it could be all of these sorts of things are usually grouped into either one big bucket or they break it out by item. But almost very often I see flatline shrinkage, which means that they'll say, here's my volume forecast, here's my handle time forecast, and my shrinkage forecast is straight. And it's a big mistake. First off, it's something that is predictable, it's something that isn't flat, and it's something that has a huge impact on your service delivery. If I pick, when I'm putting together a longer term plan and figuring out when to hire people and those sorts of things, if I pick the same shrinkage item week over week and it's wrong, being off about 2% on shrinkage is the equivalent of being off 7% on your volume forecast. So getting your shrinkage forecast right is very important. Flatlining is picking the same one week over week over week, 35%, 40%, 60%, whatever your shrinkage items are, picking it the same week over week, by definition, you will have the wrong forecast and you will put together the wrong plan. It's probably the single simplest thing that you folks can do in your spreadsheets today to improve your overall forecasting. I can pull this up in our system, but there are, you can draw sensitivity analysis curves. I'll show you a couple in here, I think. Sensitivity analysis curves where you basically fluctuate one thing. I can fluctuate volume and seeing what effect being wrong on my volume is on my overall service delivery. And being off 5% on in most of the models I see being about 5% wrong on my volume leads to about a service level error of about 5 to 7%. Being off 2% gets me to that same 5% in the error on service level. 2% on shrinkage equals about 5% on service delivery. It sort of depends upon the contact center. But this is one of the easiest things that you can fix to put together a plan. Okay. Next thing is, in most spreadsheets, here's the way spreadsheets work, is they'll put together a volume forecast. People may put together a handle time forecast. They typically don't forecast shrinkage. And then what you do is you figure out using an Erlang calculation or using a workload calculation, you'll figure week over week, here's how many people I need. You compare that to the number of people you have, and maybe you subtract out attrition, agents quitting, and you say, I think I'm going to need about 12 people in about 6 weeks. I think I'm going to need about 25 people in about 7 weeks. And you just look at the over-under, how many people I'm short versus how many people I'm over. And then folks will get, there's a term, it's guess and test. It means I'm going to make a guess, say maybe I can hire 12 people this week. Maybe I'm going to hire 17 people this week. Maybe I'm going to hire 5 people in this center and 4 people in this center. And it's just it's a manual process where an analyst is actually doing the hiring planning. And that's the way almost as a matter of fact, every spreadsheet I've ever seen, that's the process. It's also a very hard problem to solve. Figuring out when to hire, knowing that there's learning curves and there's seasonality and all of these things is a very hard thing to do manually with a spreadsheet. And so there are a series of mathematical techniques, I'll talk about one here in a second, that will help you do that better. And the math 100% of the time beats the manual process. How many around, when I first learned scheduling. When I first got out of school and started doing workforce management stuff, we scheduled by hand with a big piece of paper for the airline and colored pencils, and I am colorblind. And so that was the technology. And then we got Lotus 1, 2, 3, and we started doing it in a spreadsheet. And then our first workforce management systems came out. But the difference between putting together hiring plans is optimally versus in a spreadsheet is the same. You'll get the same sort of benefits that you got when putting together schedules in a spreadsheet versus using a workforce management system. Now, there's some great technologies out there. This is just a screenshot of an input sheet into one of these technologies. The technologies are called, it's not something I've created, it's something that was created, I think it was created in World War II to help people plan for convoys. The technology is called integer programming or linear programming. You might have heard it, or you might remember it from college. And what it does is it takes the math problem, the when to hire, given a lead time and given peaks and valleys and all this, and that there's different centers that have different behaviors and different handle times, and it will turn it into a bunch of math. It will solve that math, and it'll come back with the mathematically provable hiring plan or capacity plan that hits your service goal if it can. Okay, so there are techniques out there, and the one I would have you look up is something called linear or integer programming. It's just this great technology. You don't need to buy any commercially available software to use it. You can actually do it yourself. It's intimidating to look at it first, but it's not that hard. Okay. All right, number 3. We sort of touched on this, and so we can go through this relatively quickly, is all call centers are not the same. The fact that Dallas has a different handle time from California, which has a different handle time from my Annapolis center in the US, it means that each one of them have different efficiencies. And so knowing the efficiency of every center is very important to putting together an optimal or an efficient plan. So when we look at those things that are differently seasonal, those are things that you should take into consideration when you put together your plan. A lot of spreadsheets, what we see happen is that they group them all up as one big gigantic call center, and then at the end they allocate out the resources to the different centers. That's highly, what's the right word, unoptimal, not optimal, it's inefficient. So what you want to do is you want to treat them all separately if you can. Any questions or thoughts about this? Okay. All right, this is one of my favorite ones. The saying, it's called stretch goal in the United States. And a stretch goal is this, which is you put together a plan, the planners put together a plan, they've put together the forecast, they've spent 6 weeks, and they finally present it to finance and the operational man, the COO or the head of the call centers. And they present the plan and they say, here's what we think is going to happen, here's how much money we need based upon all of our forecasts, here's what our handle times are going to be and what our volumes are going to be. Here's my plan. And they sit down and they talk about it for about 3 hours. They challenge them on assumptions. It's an 80-page document. And then at the end they say, you know what, we've decided that your handle times are going to be about 30% lower and you're going to get about 20% fewer people. And you go, how? And they go, I don't know, we're going to figure it out. And so what they're doing is they're giving you a stretch goal. In this case, the stretch goal is reduce your handle times. So what that typically means is that you have to put together a budget that has 20% lower handle time, hence the budget is lower and the number of people that you're going to hire is lower. And then you have to put together some sort of project. Somebody has to put together a project to reduce the handle times. What happens is at this point in time, the executive and the or the CFO or the finance team is what they're doing is they're introducing an awful lot of business risk into your plan, because if that project isn't successful, it means that I'm going to be severely understaffed. It means that our operation is going to not hit their service goals. If I'm selling things in my call center, it means that I'm not going to sell as many as I should have. So it introduces a lot of risk into your plan. There are many companies that they introduce a lot of these. There's 12 improvement plans for the year. We're going to reduce our handle times. We're going to do a better job of training, and because they're training better, they're going to sell more things. We're going to, just all of these different things that they overlay into the plan. And what it does is it makes the people who are doing planning, it makes them sort of shadow project managers. They have to make sure that the projects are working, otherwise their plans don't work. I've seen a great example is a very large financial institution, which you all know of in the States. They had an emergency, and the emergency was this. they've noticed that their volume forecast, their handle time forecast was off. And their handle times were much higher than they expected. And so what they did is they convened a meeting and they brought the forecasters in and they basically yelled at the forecasters and said, you guys got to fix the forecast. This is not right. And they said, we have no idea why this is happening. So they gave it another month. Lo and behold, the handle times were still much higher than what they had forecasted. They adjusted the forecast and the handle times came in higher the month after that. And the forecasters were just getting beaten up. Lo and behold, what they found out is that the guy who was beating him up he was a new guy to the company, and he told his supervisors, you know what, we want to have the best customer experience no matter what. I'm not going to manage any of the agents on handle time. I don't care what their handle time is. Let them talk and make sure that they give them a great customer experience. They didn't tell the planners, and the planners were the ones who got the heat for that. Therein is a stretch goal that was not communicated to their planning team. Questions about this? How many of you guys ever see that? Is that something you guys see? Yeah. It's awful, isn't it? Okay. All right. Always hitting service goals is probably not optimal. Let me ask you guys a question, please. Everybody has to answer at least one of these. How did you guys come up with your service standards? Okay. All right. First one. How many people use 80-20? 80% within 20 seconds. Okay. How'd you come up with 80-20? Do you know?
My CEO.
Okay. All right. That's one of the ones. I always hear that one. My boss told me so. Okay. How'd you come up with it? Okay, all right, it's what our boss. How many people use, it's what we've always done? Anybody? Okay. How many people use, what's the other one we hear? It's what we think the competition's doing, okay? It's industry standard, okay? Those are the ones that I hear the most. Every once in a while I'll hear the government is making me do it, which is more legitimate than the others. Or you'll hear, we brought in a consultant and we analyzed it 4 years ago and that's what we're using. There's all sorts of things that go into figuring out what your service standards should be, and including things like this, you know, what your economies of scale are, what your whether it's revenue producing, we think, you know, the brand is, you know, our image of the brand and what we think our customers expect and all of this sort of stuff. But here's an interesting thing, is that the optimal service standard probably isn't the same week over week. It should change, and I'll show you a graph here. How many people have revenues associated with their calls? Any revenue at all? Collections, sales, anything? Okay, there's a few. I got my very first promotion working at an airline, and I drew this graph. And what it is, so I love it, obviously. So what it is on the x-axis, what I'm doing is I'm keeping track of service level, and on the y-axis, I'm keeping track of profit. The way that I'm changing service level is by adding people. So I have a model of my call center. I add one person, and I see what the service level is going to be, and I see what the profit's going to be, and I plot it. And I add another person, and I keep on doing that until I get to the end, until I'm at 100% service level. And what you have here is, if you look at this point right up here, this peak, that is the point. In this case, it just so happens to be 80. That's not something we always see, but it's showing me that my profit maximizing service standard is actually an 80% service level. So I have this cool graph. I can actually analytically turn to my CEO and say, you were right. It was 80-20. Who knew? So I know what it is. But here's the interesting thing. As my margins change, this curve shifts dramatically. The profitability of the call center shifts dramatically. My story is the reason I had an airplane sitting on the previous graph is when I was doing this, there's an analysis. We were one of the old traditional big airlines. It was Northwest Airlines, and we found out that a new low-cost provider was coming into our hub. And what that meant was that they were going to reduce our costs a lot. And so before they were able to do that, what marketing decided to do was drastically cut our pricing. There was a great commercial in the United States. It was called Parents Fly Free, and it's this commercial about these kids taking their parents on a vacation. A great thing, it hit the airwaves. They got blasted with phone calls, people buying tickets. But before they did that, they came to me and they said, okay, what should we do? How many people should we hire? Because we're going to get a lot more phone calls. And I drew this graph, and then I drew this graph with the margins that they were telling me they were going to sell their tickets at, and I said we should lay off 30% of our staff. And they said, we can't, we're going to get a lot more phone calls. And I said, yes, but you're not making any money on any of these airplane tickets, hence it doesn't make any sense to hire more people. Not only that, but your customers are going to be a lot more patient. Because they're going to hang out on the phone more, this curve's going to shift dramatically to the left, and we should run a 20% service level. And nobody listened to me, but the idea is the same, which is at different times of year, you should run a different service standard. So a great example is that we've got a couple of customers who are hotel chains, and they're very highly seasonal businesses. But there's something that happens also within the seasonality of their profits or of their revenues, and that's this, which is during, in the States, the summer vacation season, they their prices drop dramatically because people are more price sensitive. And so where they might be selling a hotel room for $200 a night, now they're selling it for $75 a night. And so what you have at this point is that this curve shifts dramatically to the left and says run a lower service standard. Other times of the year, when us business travelers are traveling, we're not as price sensitive. We need to get someplace, and that's the price, that's the price. And so because of that, the curve shifts to the right. So, but what these companies are doing is they're running different service standards by month or by season, which is very interesting, and they save a lot of money because of that. All right, this is a hard thing to talk about here a little bit. We talked a little bit about introducing risk to the operation. One of the things that you should always do is you should do a bit of variance analysis. We'll talk about that here in a second. Variance analysis is basically look at what happened and compare it to what I thought was going to happen. Right? Let's look at my plan and see if my plan is tracking true. Oftentimes, you will see in your data that something changes, which is a great thing. As soon as if your plan is showing that we expected, in this case, handle time to be, say, 200 seconds, and it's turning out to be 240 seconds, that has huge resourcing implications to my contact center. So simply by checking it and making sure that I always produce a report that shows that there's some difference, what I can do is I can prepare my contact center as quickly as possible to react to those changes. So in this case, let's say that we found that our handle time is increasing. So what happens at that point? At that point, when you notice something changing in your environment, what does that mean? It means that you have to make somebody has to make a decision. Okay, it becomes a decision-making point. It's something's changing. What are we going to do? So the very first thing you do is you sit down with your management and say, hey, you know what, our handle time forecast is off, and they beat you up a little bit if you're the forecaster. But more importantly, you suddenly shine light onto the idea that things are different from what we expected. And so at that point, you can make a decision, or you can wait, and your decision can be, let's see what's going to happen next month. But at some point, you're going to get to the point where you're almost called out to make a decision. You have to make a decision either to resource or not to resource. And so what you would like to do is when you put together a plan, at this point, our variance is different, so I need to put together a whole new plan. Something's happening in our handle times. So you have what you want to do is put together a series of scenarios. And what I've done here is, if you say, there's two things that I can do, or there's two things that could occur. One is that our handle time continues to grow. Another thing that could happen is that it goes back to normal and everything's fine. So let's say that those are the two options that I have of what could occur in my call center. Well, before I know what it really is, I have to make a decision. And the decision could be staff as though it's going to continue to grow. Another option I could have is treat it as though it's a blip and just staff normally, and just my service standards will be low for a little while. Or I can maybe staff somewhere in the middle, which is what we have in this second column. Okay, so the result though is if we planned as though it was going to increase, and it did increase, well then I'm covered. Everything's great. I've got my services under control. My costs are a little higher, but they need to be higher. If we staffed as though it was a blip and we didn't hire, but it did grow, well then what we're going to get? Well, we can figure out what we're going to have to offer a lot of overtime. We're going to have to increase our costs, and our service is going to be terrible for a long time. Our attrition is going to go up. Our agents are going to quit. Our occupancy is going to be too high. So all of those things could happen. And if I were to make that decision, and then the third decision I made is, well, I'm going to be somewhere in the middle with that. But what I'm doing is I'm drawing out a series of at one point we gave this a name, and I don't remember what it was, but it's a table that outlines all of the decisions that your executives can make and the repercussions if they choose wrong, so that you can actually present it saying, here's the risk matrix associated with what's happening in our call center today. And what it requires me to do is run more than one plan, run a bunch of different plans and evaluate the results. So if you can present a series of plans, that's good. Anybody ever, how often, for those of you who do planning, how often are you asked to redo your plan, do a what if analysis or those sorts of things? A lot? Yes? Yes? Weekly, okay. Yeah. Okay, well, let's talk about weekly. There you go. Weekly is better than monthly. We do see in a lot of folks' plans that they'll put together a monthly plan. My plan for this month is this, my plan for the next month is this. And so in their spreadsheets, we see 12 columns, one for each month. That's not optimal. It's usually what finance likes to see, but it's not optimal for operational planning. So for operational planning, what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to put together a plan at the appropriate level of detail, which for most call centers is a week-over-week plan. Because things change within a month. We all know that. At the beginning of this month, I'm going to have a much higher volume than at the end of the month. And so we want to be able to do that. So there is oftentimes within a month there is its own seasonality associated with that. And you need to be able to capture that. So it's important that you go to the appropriate level of detail. So even if finance is asking you for a monthly plan, what you want to be able to do is give them, you develop your plans on a weekly basis, you roll everything up to a month so that they can see what that looks like. Okay, there are, I have seen this happen a few times. I've seen consultants do this, not PlanMen. I've seen them take a problem, like back to the problem of what is the optimal service standard, okay? Figuring out what your service goal is a very important thing to do right. And we showed you how we could do it with profit curves or cost curves. We can figure out what our service standard should be by month or by week. But a lot of folks, what they'll do is they'll say, I'm going to look at my peak week in my peak hour of my peak week of my my peak day, whatever it is. I'm going to look at the peak, and that for that hour I'm going to figure out what my service level goal should be, and that becomes a service level for the year. That's not right. That's not the way you should do it. Any kind of operational analysis that you should do, especially if it's a longer term. So, for example, if I'm trying to figure out what happens for the rest of the day, sure, look at your peak, because that's in 3 hours. If I'm looking at a decision like hiring, which especially here in the Netherlands and in Europe, hiring is a very important problem. I mean, it's a very important decision because you hire folks and they're going to be around for a little while. And what you want to be able to do is you want to make the right decision. But it's not a point in time. It's not what's going to happen in 3 hours. It's what's going to happen over the next 18 months. So the longer term questions that you have, like hiring, like putting together, resourcing your call center, those deserve an analysis that encompasses about 18 months out. The reason why you want to look 18 months is because your hiring decisions affect you more than the next month and more than the month after that. And about 18 months is about optimal. Are there any questions about any of this stuff so far, guys? No? Okay. We talked about, I probably should have put this slide before number 7. Let's talk about variance analysis. So you sit down and you put together a plan, and I got a volume forecast or a handle time forecast, and I noticed that my plan is not close to my actual. So I noticed that my volumes are higher than I thought or lower than I thought, or my handle times are different. Going through the process of seeing that at least every month and saying, here's what we thought was going to happen and here's what actually happened, is a great exercise. It's an exercise that everybody should do. So what happens if that were to occur? Well, the first thing is that the forecaster could have just made a mistake, right? My volumes are coming in lower than I expected. Maybe I did something wrong with my math. Maybe something external is changing the mix of calls. We have had a really weird year in the United States because for a lot of industries, banking for sure, healthcare for sure, telecommunications for sure, the government has been getting themselves involved. And any time that a senator says something on TV, it generates a whole bunch of phone calls. So something external could be changing that. Or maybe there's new rules around the way that they have to process their customers. So something external could have happened. Something internal could have happened, like in the example with that large financial services company, where they where the manager said, here's the way we're going to do our business, and he forgot to tell the forecaster. So that could have happened. Or it could just be a random occurrence. We can't figure it out. But the point of the matter is the best way of viewing forecasts, how many folks actually do forecasts? Okay, all right, it's a tough job. here's what you should tell your boss that I told you this, is the way when the forecaster misses his forecast, don't blame the forecaster. Look for things external that are changing the forecast that the math couldn't know. Math is only as good as math is. It can do a good job if everything's normal, but things aren't always normal. And because of that, what you want to do is you want to view your forecast as though it is the canary in the coal mine, right? And you view variance as though it's a canary in the coal mine. Something's changing. The environment is changing. And what you want to be able to do is go back and say, why is that happening? I can't blame my forecast because the forecast is as good a knowledge as we have today. When I put together my forecast, I'm trying to do as good a job as I can. I'm using the best math. I'm using the best information I have. But if my forecast is off, it means that something has changed in my baseline and the environment has changed. So the best organizations usually view their forecast as an early warning, or their variance as an early warning signal, their forecast as their baseline. Okay, this is this number 10? Okay, we're almost done. This is one of my pet peeves. When I first started in contact centers, because I'm a math guy, one of the very first things I tried to do is I tried to build plans, and at the time I was using an Erlang C calculation, and I noticed that there was a bias in my model. I noticed that when I tried to figure out what service level would be, it was different from what it actually was. And so went through a process, and we ended up changing. We went to a simulation model, which I think I'm going to talk about here in a second. But the idea is, no matter what mathematical technique you're using, especially when we're talking about here the models that say, given my volume, how many people do I need? The translation, and most people use either Erlang C calculation. How many people use Erlang C? Okay. Anybody use something called a workload calculation? You take occupancy, you forecast occupancy, and okay, that's something that's popular in the States. It's not very accurate. Anybody use simulation modeling? Simulation? Oh, cool. Good. What you want to be able to do is you want to be able to prove that translation is accurate, that if I know the volume, if I know the handle time, if I know how many people I have, then the service level or occupancy or abandon or average speed of answer or costs, all of those things are actually accurate. And the translation being the Erlang C calculation or whatever else you're using. Some people are using modified Erlangs now too. So what you do is you go through a process, and the process is actually very simple. And I'm colorblind, so the triangles, let me see if I got this right. I can't even tell that. The triangles, I think, are what happened in the call center, and the circles are what the simulation model said would happen in the call center. And it's very important that these things track. Simply go back, take the last 6 months or last week or the last 7 hours or whatever it is, and look at the number of calls, look at the volume, look at the raw number of people you had available to work, plug it into your calculation or your simulation or whatever it is that you're using to figure out how many people you need or what your service will be. See what service level your model says would happen versus what actually happened. And that process is called validation. And it's one of the very first things that they teach you as a mathematical modeler is they teach you, first off, prove that your model's right. So if you were to go through the process of proving this, saying, look how accurate my in this case, the simulation model is. When service is great, it's accurate. When service is terrible, it's accurate. Everywhere in between, it's accurate. So I know that my bias in this particular case on service level, I'm slightly under predicting service level by 0.07. That's a great model. I'm a half a second off when it comes to average speed of answer. My abandonment rate, I'm off 0.08. That's great. So this is a great model. Most models aren't this good. But the point of the matter is by proving it, I can go up to my senior management and I can talk to them about that and say, look, I've got this accurate planning process. This is something we're actually developing a white paper. It's right now in our marketing department who's making it look pretty. But we've gone through a whole bunch of different call centers, and we compared Erlang to actual staffing, and what we found is Erlang tends to overstaff. I'm going to make up a number because I don't remember in the paper, but somewhere between 5 and 10, maybe 12%. So it's always, there's this overstaffing bias that's almost always there. Not always, I'll tell you what the exception is. So because of that, if you're using an Erlang calculation, going through this validation process is actually pretty important because you need to know what your bias is. The thing that makes it a little tough is if you notice here in this graph, this is by hour of day and the number of staff required. And all I've done is said, I used Erlang to say, here's the number of staff required, and I saw how many people we actually had. And you can see in this first hour, we did really good. Second hour, we did really good. Third hour, we're off, what is it, 30%, something crazy like that? It's not always consistently off. It tends to be off a lot sometimes and not off other times. And it tends to follow when there are more abandons. So because an Erlang C calculation assumes nobody abandons, that assumption will drive the requirement process to be off. If you look at interactive intelligence, and I'm hoping in a couple of weeks there should be a white paper about this, and it's what we did is I think we took 7 or 8 different call centers and we just simply ran it through Erlang and ran it through a simulation model and saw the error and the bias and all that sort of stuff. Okay, for those of us who have spreadsheets, there's some universal qualities about spreadsheets. The number one is that spreadsheets are very hard technology to use on very complicated systems. And a planning spreadsheet is a very complicated system. So it's very easy to make mistakes. A great story, I was out at, it was Avis Car Rental. And we were converting their spreadsheets into our software. And so we spent a lot of time, like I said, I spent a lot of time looking at spreadsheets. And in their this is a long time ago, and in their spreadsheet at the time, there was an equation. The equation was the number of staff required is a function of an Erlang function of the number of people I need. I'm sorry, my goal, my service level goal, the number, the handle time, and the number of calls, plus 15. And I said, "What's the 15?" And they said, "I don't know." It's like, how do you not know? He goes, "Well, I inherited this spreadsheet from somebody 5 years ago, and that 15. Okay, just do the math real quick. 15 times." You know, that's a $500,000 a year kind of mistake. But it was a fudge factor. And a lot of spreadsheets, it's easy to hide mistakes in the equations. They're typically not very fast. And part of the reason is kind of goes back to the first piece, which is since it's easy to make mistake, most people who are working in spreadsheets tend to go back and just simply spend a lot of time making sure that they're not making a mistake. It's in high demand. If you're doing what-if analysis for the contact center, that means that the COO is interested in what you have to say. Because of that, you might be asked to do a lot of things, some of which don't fit the spreadsheet. We talked about the accuracy of an Erlang equation or an occupancy-based equation is sort of similar. Because it's a spreadsheet, executives tend to, one of the first things they do when you, at least in my experience, when they get your plan, is they try to probe you as to how accurate you think everything is and whether you think your analysis is actually any good. They sort of don't trust the spreadsheet because of all this inaccuracy stuff that we're talking about. But when, in fact, what we should be doing is we should validate that it's accurate and then focus, instead of on the technology that I have here, we should focus on the decisions that they're trying to make. The whole point of doing a plan is to make decisions. And not only that, but most of us start with a call center spreadsheet, and then suddenly you add email, suddenly you add multi-centers, suddenly, you know, so you got multi-site, multi-channel, what else? Multi-skill, you have different skills, and suddenly the spreadsheet has just grown beyond the ability to manage it. Here's some keys. If you can, the first thing is you make sure that you check your models and prove that they're accuracy or that they're accurate. So validate that your models are accurate. That goes a long way in getting people to trust that the analysis that you're giving is actually good. As much as possible, automate as much as you can. So if you can look at that integer programming stuff, build an automatic process that'll come back off and do a hiring plan and an overtime plan for you and bring it back to you. If you can make that process really quick, what you have the ability to do is what-ifs very quickly. And the second thing is, again, if you can put together a process that it comes back with optimal answers as opposed to guess and test sorts of answers, then that'll go a long way to making sure that you have a very smooth plan. You know what, I'll tell you one story, and I think we're almost done. I was at a I heard the story. This was at our very first users conference, something like 7 or 8 years ago. And a gentleman, who was at Fidelity Invest, maybe it's re-recording this, I probably shouldn't be saying that. A gentleman at a very large financial institution presented this sort of case study at our first users conference. He was the keynote speaker. He was a real smart guy. What they did is they got software to help them automate all of this stuff, and that was accurate, and they were able to prove the accuracy. And what he ended up doing is he ended up taking his doing an analysis, proving the validation of the system, bringing it up to senior management, and basically dropping it off, saying, "We have a new system. It's fast. Look how accurate it is. We can do analysis really quick." And he waited, and sure enough, got a phone call. I don't know. A month later, saying, "Hey, smart guy, bring your laptop up to the boardroom. We have some questions for you." So he sits down at this big table, flips it open, and the big boss says, "We're thinking about a hiring freeze. Can you analyze that?" And he said, "Yes, give me 5 minutes and I can analyze it." Because it was automated, because it was fast, because he was sure is accurate. So he sat down and he keyed in for 5 minutes, and he said, "Okay, at the end of this, if you're to do this hiring freeze today, in 3 months, service will be okay, and then it'll take a dive. And in 5 months, we'll be down 20% service levels. Our abandonment rates are going to be 25%. There's something called a call center death spiral that we talk about, where your service is so bad, your agents are too burned out, your good agents quit, you can't hire fast enough, you start hiring really terrible agents, and it takes you about 2 years to come back up to speed." He says, "And we'll be in the contact center death spiral." He says, "Oh, I can't have that." He says, "How about a half a hiring freeze?" He says, "Okay, well, give me 5 minutes." He sits down and does that, clicks the buttons, optimizes his stuff, and comes back and says, "Okay, same thing's going to happen, but it's going to take us 5 months instead of 3 months." He says, "I can't have that either." And the analyst, who a really sharp guy, says, "What are you trying to do?" He says, "I need to save $2 million. He says, "How about can you give me till tomorrow? I'm going to go talk to the team and we're going to come up with some scenarios for you." So we went back down to the team. They sat down and they worked through all the different things that they can change in their environment and what the impact of making those changes would be to their service. So for example, what happens if we were to reduce our shrinkage? What happens if we did a better job of planning our training? What happens if our handle times were to come down 7 seconds? And so they put all these things together that would have an net impact on improving their costs. And they presented it back to the guy the next morning, said, "Here are the 12 things that you can do that won't affect your service level at all, so long as we can actually make sure that these things happen." So so he said, it's back to my stretch goal thing, although this is in reverse. If we improved our handle times by 7 seconds, we'll get you to your $2 million. And so they put together a plan to do whatever it is that they decided to do. But the reason they could do that is because they could go during the analysis, they could sit down and they could put together a whole plan in 5 or 10 minutes. There's no reason why you can't automate it so that you can do that. Okay, let's see what else I have here. So what happens if you're to do this well? If I put together an optimal plan, then what it means is I'm not going to have as much service variability. Jos over here is, I think you're showing that graph, right? Yep. Okay. Jos has this great graph that was done that shows this. We're doing in, I think, one of the technology breakout sessions in the next session, in E. We'll show you how folks can do this. But the idea being that if I have a plan so that this week I have this number of people, the next week I have this number of people, the next week I'm sending people away on vacation, if you do a really good job of that, it means that your service is going to be much more consistent. You're not going to have an overstaffing bias, you're not going to have an understaffing bias, and in effect what you're going to have is you're going to have a very consistent operation. You're not going to have highs and lows in service and highs and lows in agent occupancy. Your agents are going to have a very normal work day. But not only that, but if you can automate all of this stuff, if you can optimize it, what you end up with is a weird relationship with your executive management. You folks, the people who are doing the planning or the forecasting, will be the guy with the crystal ball. Will be the person who, when the executive needs an answer, they don't go to your boss or your boss's boss. They go to you and say, "Can you tell me what's going to happen if this were to occur?" And not only that, but if you do a real good job of that, we typically see about a 5 to 15% reduction in agent paid hours. What's interesting about that is it isn't that you're reducing the number of agents by 15%. It means that I'm hiring them at the right time. It means that I'm sending them away on vacation on the right time. It means that I'm offering training at the right time. I'm offering overtime at the right time. And by doing this well, what it means is that I have fewer agent hours. I hire them a little later. I offer overtime at the right time, and I don't accidentally send a lot of people home or send a lot of people out on vacation when I need overtime. You do things like that, and you end up saving a lot of money. And I think that's it. Folks, any questions? Please, we all measure this by, whether or not this was a good presentation by whether there's questions, right? You know that? Come on. Linda, what do you got?
Well, I can say we just come to our booth in one of the breaks, and we have also nice brochures in Dutch, so that you can read more about what Rick was saying. So it's, I'm the marketing manager from Inspector Intelligence.
Okay, and if any of you folks do have questions but just a little shy, go ahead and email me. There's not a person on this planet who likes talking about planning as much as I do, or have seen as much as I do, as you guys could tell. So feel free to shoot me a note. I'd be absolutely thrilled to chat with you offline too. But other than that, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. Thanks for coming out. Okay, yay.